So today's class is on Ferdinand de Saussure and his course in general linguistics. And with that, we want to talk about structuralism, which is the foundation against which post-structuralism aims its guns. So the problems with structuralism are explored by post-structuralism, post-structuralism being connected with deconstruction and various theories of the 1960s, cultural Marxism, third-wave feminism, those sorts of things arise in that. And Saussure is, I think, has a crucial and formative role in the transformation of literary theory post-1960s. And that reputation and his influence lies in this one book, a book that he didn't write. It's one that was compiled by his students and colleagues because he died in 1913, and it was from the course notes that he delivered between 1907 and 1911 when he was teaching at the University of Geneva that this book arose. And Saussure tends not to be well known comparatively to the other thinkers that are hugely influential in the academy in the 20th century, Karl Marx, everybody's heard of Marx, and Sigmund Freud, whom everybody's heard of once again. But the three are, you need to understand all three thinkers really to get a sense of the literary theories in the 20th century. But the only one that's specifically literary is probably Saussure, and that's why I'm looking at him. It's not because Freud isn't important or Marx isn't important. It's just that their areas of influence and importance fall in different disciplines. So Marx in probably politics or economics, and Freud obviously in psychology. But there are similarities between the three. So Freud and Marx see that the appearance of things, the phenomena, are undergirded by underlying systems and structures. That's what they share in common. So all three thinkers think that the appearance of things, or the phenomena, can be explained by appealing to a system or a structure. So for Marx, it's the structure of economics and social relations. For Freud, that the structure is the subconscious. It's the thing that explains what we see. He appeals to that. For Saussure, it's the system of language that undergirds or underpins everything that we see. And with this, Saussure shares a lot in common with some of the most important 20th century thinkers, and we've already mentioned one of them, Martin Heidegger. But we could also talk about Ludwig Wittgenstein. I'm pronouncing it in the German way. The W. Heidegger, Bertrand Russell could be mentioned as well, very important at one point. All of those thinkers had in common the belief that it was the structure of language that explained the phenomena, the things that we experience. But if you dig down deep, what underlies it all is the structure of language. So that's the commonality here. I said that Heidegger and Saussure were most important in terms of the structure of language and the specifically literary aspects of contemporary literary theory. In terms of ideas that influence as well, you will find that Marx will filter in as well, being hugely influential, and also Freud. Subconscious. So in our day, people speak of bias and even unconscious bias, right? Which Dr. Jordan Peterson says there is no such thing, or there has been no verification or proof that there is such a thing as unconscious bias. So if it can't be proven, it can't be disputed either. It can just be alleged. But at that point, it's, I would say, like believing in unicorns. I mean, there might be, such a thing as a unicorn, but until somebody actually demonstrates that there is one, it remains a hypothesis. But at the moment it's being assumed. Well, why? And again, I think it's because of an appeal to a substructure of consciousness there, and with that, an indirect appeal to Freud. So those ideas don't go away. They're all there, and they tend to go together because in each case, they're appealing to something that we can't see to explain what we can see. And in that sense, in my own work, I've said that in many ways it's going back to a metaphysical way of looking at things. So in Aristotelian terms, physics is referring to things that we can observe. What explains physics is metaphysics. And metaphysics for Aristotle is connected to cosmology as well. So things that are above the earth and the heavens and so forth, and the influences, particularly in medieval thought. And they banish metaphysics, and after Kant says there can be no more metaphysics, it's ridiculous, the idea of metaphysics. We're going to base it only on phenomena, only things we can see. And what I note, and I think is indisputable, but then I guess I would since it's what I say, I think it's true, is that we got rid of metaphysics in the sense of the old cosmology, and we brought it back in other ways. Things that explain what we can see. And one of them is this one, the structure of language, and that brings us back to Saussure. And he is Saussure is the chief thinker in this area. And they are profoundly influential on the structural linguistics of a group of writers called the Prague Circle. I'm not going to get into them here, but Jacobson and so forth. And also the structural anthropology of Claude Lévi-Strauss, which if I do have time at the end of this, I might get into briefly. There's an accent in here, isn't there? Somewhere, yes, there is. So now it starts to bleed into anthropology and so forth. And I was just speaking to one of my colleagues in the linguistics department here, and I need to say what I think I said a couple of classes ago, that there are different traditions of linguistics. Some of them more practical, some of them more theoretical. This one's more theoretical. The irony is that in terms of its actual influence in Western thought, this is far more influential than the practical linguistics that our linguistics department does, because the foundations of contemporary literary theory will bleed into every discipline, from literature, which is what we're focusing on here, to biblical studies, to the field of education, to the field of psychology, to the fields of history. All of them are influenced by this. So it's practical in the sense that it's had its effect in the academy. Does it help people learn a language and understand a language? In that sense, I think it's probably impractical and not very helpful. So it's more of an academic influence, and it reflects the role of the academy in the 20th century. So I'm going to look at the main tenets of Saussure's theory because they are the basis for what we're going to say and respond to in later elements of the course. So Saussure argues that, I'm just looking for a whiteboard behind me, the object of linguistic study is a system of conventions. And the conventions are both in terms of words and grammar. So let me get rid of Lévi-Strauss. And there are underlying conventions there by virtue of which a sign can mean something. And these lead to signs. And the sign, a language is a system of signs. And the sign is the basic unit of meaning. And the sign is comprised of two things. And I'll give you illustrations of signifier and a signified. The two together comprise a sign, and language is a whole system of signs. And the signifier is the word image, and the signified is the mental concept. So this is the word image, and this is the mental concept. So the signifier, tree, has the mental concept of a tree. So when you use the word tree in English, we think of a tree. Now note, and important to mention, Saussure is not talking about the distinction between a name and a thing. Remember back to Augustine, when he talked about a race and a signa, a sign and a thing. That's not what so this is not a signa and this is a race. That's not what he means by it. So this is one of the challenges when even trying to track what Saussure is saying, is to try and integrate it and critique it, because he's coming up with ideas on his own as if there were no tradition of thinking about these things. And there is a very rich one, and a very lucid one, and a very rational one that we looked at last semester, but he actually almost ignores that. And I would say that he probably operates, and I tried to explain this last time or two classes ago, within the context of the Kantian way. Saussure is a Swiss academic, and he probably operates with Immanuel Kant's idea of the critique of pure reason, which gets rid of understanding, right? He just wipes it out. There are no points of understanding. And so what he's trying to do with this is establish the basis for reasoning to work, and it comes out of language. I said the same thing with Heidegger. He's got to come up with because reason is just, there's nothing there. It's just pure reasoning. That's all that left. What had occurred to me afterwards is I was being a bit unfair to Kant. The same thing happens in English with John Locke, because he says that the mind is like a tabula rasa, which is usually translated as a blank slate. There's literally nothing there. There's no basis for anything. There's no foundation. And for Locke, it gets put together through empirical ideas and connected through the imagination and so forth. Kant comes at it a little differently, but they more or less agree that the mind doesn't have fixed form points of understanding like the medievals would have thought. Like, understanding is the basis for our reasoning. Whereas in both Locke and in Kant, reasoning is the basis for our understanding. So it's a complete inversion, and it actually happens before Kant. It's just that Kant spells it out. But they are actually in agreement on that. There's no basis for our understanding except for reasoning. And again, it's a total inversion of what both the medieval mind and the classical mind had thought. Am I losing you here? Probably. No? No? Okay. I'm trying to make it as coherent as I possibly can. But so the signifier tree here gives rise to the idea of a tree. But when we say that, he's not talking about what Augustine calls a signa and a race, a thing. He's not saying that, so I'll put that in brackets. But that's what you might think he was thinking about. Like, here's a word, and I have that sense of a real thing, because the mental concept for Augustine, the race is referring to something that is essentially true and never changes. Like, it's the essence of the thing. And when I raise that, the reason I want to mention that very briefly is around 1947, a man by the name of Richard M. Weaver wrote this book. Is this the right what have I got for the date? 1948. Ideas Have Consequences, and he is a very interesting book. I think I mentioned it last semester. He traces the influence of an old debate, medieval debate, into the modern age, and it's the debate between the nominalists on the one hand and the realists on the other. And the nominalists are effectively in the position of those of the structuralists and the post-structuralists, which is they think that words relate to other words, but they never relate to things. They can't ever connect with things. The nominalist had the view of language that contemporary literary theorists have, that words only ever refer to words, but they never grab hold of the essence of the thing, the reality of the thing. Words can't do that. And the realists, on the other hand, and again, you can read Weaver's account of it, I think it's broadly accurate, would say that actually no, words do, and if they don't do that, there are terrible consequences for making truth statements. Okay, so I do trace that out because he traces the whole of Western thought as, and again, the title is revealing ideas have consequences. So what is the consequence of the idea that words don't actually lay hold of something essentially true? And the idea, it breaks up and the world becomes meaningless and vacant of truth, etc. So he pushes it beyond what I've talked about on the course. The problem doesn't begin in the Renaissance, it doesn't begin in the Enlightenment, it goes further back to a debate in the medieval world. And let's just call that an academic debate, but we're describing the same thing. And I'm not even sure that I disagree with him, but I'm not able to judge whether he's correct about his broader contention. But at the signifier and the signified here, so the word tree and the concept tree are not are only separable at the analytic level. So we can talk about the word and then the concept. So we can talk, but we can't separate them at the realm of thought. The word image can't be separated from the mental concept. He just says that it's there. So the first principle of his theory is that the sign is arbitrary. Now the word arbitrary has certain connotations in English, and the one obvious connotation, of being arbitrary in English is that it is random. It's not logical. That's not the root meaning of arbitrary, though, and I'm quite sure that Saussure has enough actual linguistic knowledge as languages that he would understand that the word arbitrary is connected with the Latin word arbitrio, which means will. It's just purely a matter of will. It's not connected to the nature of things. It's just arbitrary in the sense that someone can call it a tree, and the French can call it an arbre, and a German can call it a Baum, etc. Right? It's just, it varies from language to language, and it's purely a matter of volition then. I think that's what he means. It's solely up to the will. And in this, he's probably leaning on Schopenhauer, who talks about the world as will and representation. That's the name of his work. So that is how Schopenhauer explains the world. A very deep skeptic that our language is a reflection of our will, and then Nietzsche follows in Schopenhauer's wake and so forth, and places an influence on the will. But the will takes on a primary role here. Now, just let me pull back just a second. In terms of the human person, historically, the person would be considered to have three parts. You would have a reason, a will, and the passions. or the appetites. And the reason, furthermore, based on what I've just said, would be working on the basis of understanding, which would be above reason even. Because the understanding, the intellectus, is what we had in common with the angels. So there were certain fixed points upon which we had to rely in order to use our reason rightly. Milton calls it right reason for that reason. So the understanding, we had certain things in common. Yeah. And that was what they called intellectus. And that thing, but we would operate and we would apply our reason to these points of understanding, and we ought to think about the world in accordance with reasoning that would be rightly orientated on understanding, which is the way which would be logical and so forth, right? But that was the basis for applying reasoning. Now that's the medieval way of looking at things. The modern way of looking at it is either in accordance with, so there's an irony. It's called a critique of pure reason. So you would have thought they're, again, doing the exact same thing. Right? They're still just doing what the medievals are doing. They're using the word reasoning. But as I said, in both Kant and, for that matter, in Locke, they invert the two so that reasoning is more important than understanding. So they flip the medieval conception on its head so that there is no more understanding, actually, as the basis. We're going to use pure reasoning, nothing prior. And I quoted the Royal Society and its motto, nullius in verba. Trust no one's words. Don't lean on the understanding of others in order to make your own speculation. So the appeal to reason, ironically, if it has no understanding, is left with nothing to reason about, and it leaves us with pure will or pure passions. And so when Saussure says that signs are arbitrary, he is actually, I think, suggesting that that the words are not connected to a race; they're connected to other signs, and the relation of sign to sign is not firmly founded in any reality. It's founded purely on the intention of the speaker. So it's what I mean by words, that's what they mean. So if you look at Alice in Wonderland, I think that's the Mad Hatter, is it the Queen of Hearts? And she says that words mean exactly what I mean. That's what words mean. They mean what I mean them to mean. So it's purely an act of will. And from that, I think, comes all sorts of serious problems in the 20th century and uses of language and abuses of language. And at that point, there's no distinction between propaganda on the one hand and true speaking on the other hand. It's all a form of will. And that is how the 20th century will see even the Christian conception or the prior understanding of words. They regard that as simply an act of will on the part of the church or on the part of people in positions of power. So they apply their view of language retroactively and say that it held true of prior ages as well. It was just an exercise of will and therefore of power. Right? And this will explain why Christians ought not to be able to be engaged in dialogues, at least according to the Academy in our day, because after all, in the past, Christians were oppressors. They used their language to exclude people, marginalize them, whatever. And so we're going to exclude that sort of, and the idea of a debate where discussions could be settled by an appeal to a truth, a race, for them is an appeal to an exploded metaphysics and notion of the world, because language is all about the exercise of will and therefore the exercise of power. So I'm looking at consequences before I even explain the concept through, but I want to do that. So let me pull back a bit now. So the first principle, once again, is that the sign is arbitrary. That is on two levels. It is on the level of the signifier. And secondly, at the level of the signified. Those two together comprise a sign. A sign is comprised of a signifier and a signified. At the level of the signifier, it's arbitrary because there's no necessary connection between the signifier, so let's say tree, and the signified concept of a tree, what I think of when I use that word tree. There's no necessary connection. And in that sense, it's arbitrary. At the level of the signified, so it could be, as I say, it could be the French word arbre or baum or arbor in Latin. It could be those things, right? So it's not necessary. It could be replaced by, or you fill in the blank, whatever word or mental concept, or rather whatever signifier you use in whatever language that means tree in that language, right? It's not all the same. I don't even know what the Chinese for it, but fill it in. It's a different signifier. So it's not a necessary thing on that level. On the level of signified, it's arbitrary in the sense that it could be associated with, sorry, I'm losing my way here. What's signified by that, it could mean something different. I mean, I don't know exactly what an example of that would be. But the point here is that it's all arbitrary, and therefore it's all a matter of volition, that is of the will, and therefore it's all a matter of usage. And it's not a matter of, there's no right answer to that question. So all languages use a different word. None of them are correct. None of them are true in their signifier. So, and nobody would dispute this, by the way. Say, okay, like that. In English, we say it's a tree. In French, an arbre. In German, a baum. In Latin, an arbor, whatever. We're not going to insist that one of them is correct and the others are wrong. In terms of the signified, on the other hand, the idea of the tree, the concept of it, this is more challenging. At that level, they're going to dispute that there is such a thing as an essence of a tree, an idea of a tree. This is far more complex. So if you want to think about Platonic forms and particulars, so there's a particular instance of a tree, and then there's an ideal concept of what a tree is, and everyone understands when we use the word tree or arbor or baum that we have an image of tree in our mind, and it's all the same image. But not so, says Saussure and his followers. Why not? Because language and the meaning from words derives its significance from other words, and only from other words, because we can't think outside of language. That's why we don't have a realm of ideas underpinning our usage of language. Now, contradistinguish that to what Augustine said, which is we have an idea first, and then we articulate it. Or think of what the C.S. Lewis's argument in Mere Christianity, which is basically appealing to the rationality and the lucidity and the universality of the concept of justice. Every child understands what justice is, which is why they all say to one another, it's not fair. Even down to being very small children, they appeal to a concept which is in some ways highly complex and abstract, and yet they all know what it is. And they recognize it, and not only do they recognize it, they understand what the principles of it are. And so they can argue about it, and they can come to an agreement on it, and it's no longer just a subjective thing. So they have an idea before they have a word, but not in this. It originates in words, and it can't even be thought of outside of words. So this rules out a mental concept. So the mental concepts only derive from the play of signifiers. So there is no such, these mental concepts per se don't even exist. They arise from the play of signifiers. If that makes any sense. And the relation there is a matter of convention then, between these two. The reason why it's not as unstable as it sounds is certain conventions get established in English, so we all call it a tree. Somebody can't just come along and say, well, today I'm going to call it Pfiffeltrigi, the beast in Out of the Silent Planet. We're going to call it a Pfiffeltrigi from now on. That's not what we say in English. So conventions come, but the conventions themselves are specific to that language usage, but they're not actually relating to the essence of the thing, or even a coherent idea of the thing. So not only do they, now let me move on from that then. Is that more or less clear? I mean, it's, okay. So not only do different languages use different signifiers, like tree, Baum, Arbre, they also approach the phenomenal world, the world that as it appears to us, differently. So they use different language-specific concept. They use different signifieds. So sometimes they think of different things by different uses of words. They have different associations with it. And for that reason, in some languages, there are concepts that don't even exist in other language. In German, there's a word called gemütlich, which is untranslatable into English. And I understand there's a similar word in Danish, and I can't remember the name of it now. But it relates to, and it's gemütlich is not quite the same as the Danish word, which I can't even think of now, but as associations of being warm and cozy and comfortable and appropriate and all that sort of stuff. No equivalent concept. So it's literally an untranslatable word. There is no English equivalent for it. And in English, what we do with that is we just adopt that word into English and make it our English word, because that's what English is like. It just is. It's a colonizing language in that sense, and I don't mean that in the pejorative, oppressive, colonial type thing. It's just we import words from other languages for which there is no equivalent, and we adopt it, and we don't even try and translate it or come up with an equivalent. We just use the original word. So an example of that is, what is it? Schadenfreude. It's a German concept, which is the delight at somebody else's harm. It sounds better in German. Schadenfreude ist die beste Freude. Yeah. The best delight is delight in somebody else's harm. Perverse Germans. Another would be Zeitgeist from German, spirit of the age, right? We just use that phrase. Don't even sometimes pronounce it rightly. You call it a Zeitgeist or something like that. Whatever. It happens in all languages, by the way. They don't know how to pronounce it in the original. And those sorts of things that they get brought in. So they look at the world, they cut the phenomenal world differently, and they will use different signified. Now, the important point to grasp here is that language isn't a naming process. And this will, again, distinguish itself from Augustine, who operates on the idea of naming. There's a nomen for the race. And that will fit in with the tradition of Adam naming the animals. When he names them, he's not arbitrarily doing it, at least historically that would not be the understanding. He's actually talking with his word, and he's defining the essence of the thing. So when he speaks of Eve, he calls her Eve, and Eve means the mother of all living, we're told by Hebrew scholars. He doesn't decide he's going to call his wife, Smith. Everyone's calling their children by surnames these days. He doesn't decide he's going to call her Smith or Jones or whatever. He's going to call her Eve because it's a reflection of who she is. Right? So it goes down to it. So it's not a naming process. It's a signifying process. And not the same thing is not intended there. Because language here doesn't operate, at least to Saussure, does not operate by naming things and concepts that have a meaning independent existence. So the concepts in this, there's a world of ideas which Plato recognizes, which Aristotle recognizes, that we can think about and we can reason about, and it exists independent of speech. There is no such thing in Saussure. Nothing can be reasoned about that isn't already evident to us in language. So language, our speech acts give rise to our ability to understanding of things. Now, let me pull back once more. think of this in terms of Christian theology. In Christian theology, as articulated in Scripture, when God speaks, things come into existence. So depending on God's speech acts, things actually arise into being. They didn't exist before. Now they do exist. And then Adam comes along and he names them. Now, when he names them, he doesn't create them. They were already there. But he does talk about the essential property or nature of the thing. Whereas here, the speech act never determines its true nature, but it does, on the other hand, express what the person means by it. So it's his personal meaning. It's not the meaning, it's not meaning for everybody, it's meaning for him. Or if it's a community that's using signified, it's what the community means by these words. And the conventions that arise out of it. But the conventions, by the way, are just conventions. It never goes so far as talking about the nature of the thing. And so you will get in this a discussion of a conventional view of language versus a natural view of language. And that might not be a bad way of looking at it as well. But language for Saussure never talks about things as having an independent, meaningful existence. And he says that, and here's the quote, if words stood for pre-existing entities, they would all have exact equivalence in meaning from one language to the next, he says. But this isn't true, says Saussure. So that he's debunking the idea that there can be an independent existence because all people don't agree on the nature of reality. I think that's a bad argument. It's effectively saying because, and it's an equivalent of the argument that's often used against theology and the story of the elephant. So one describes the elephant, it's the blind man and the elephant. One goes and grabs the trunk of it and says, well, what's an elephant? Well, it's hairy and it's squishy and you can move it and so forth. The other is grabbing the leg of the elephant and said, no, it goes up and down, it's quite solid and it has this shape. And the other is grasping the tusk and said, no, it's smooth and right and so on. And the idea with that is that all of these things are our use of language using to describe reality as we experience it, and therefore there is no elephant is the explanation for all of this. That's the same argument that Saussure is suggesting here. Because they don't all agree on the fundamental nature of reality, there is no reality as such. The usual retort to this is that they all understood that there was an elephant there. They disagreed about the properties of the elephant, but they all did talk about an elephant. C.S. Lewis comes at it a little differently in his Abolition of Man, talks about not the differences between different religions, but the fundamental similarities, and he calls that the Tao. That's another response to it, and probably a better one. But note that Saussure denies the Tao. That's the implication I want you to see here. There is no Tao. There is no moral nature, and there's not even no Tao. There's no epistemology. There's no basic epistemology. It's not just an ethical system, a moral system. There's also no aesthetic system. There's also no system of truth, logical consequence, and so forth. It's all arbitrary. It's all conventional. So one of his illustrations for this is the spectrum. You know, that what you learn in school, the spectrum of colors. And and these actually form a continuum. White, light, all the colors together are white, right? Together, you learn that, and a prism breaks them up. You have white light, breaks it into different colors. So the part of the spectrum which runs from blue through to red does not consist of a series of different colors, blue, green, yellow, orange, red, existing independently of each other. The spectrum is just a continuum which our language divides up in a particular way. It's just a linguistic way of describing it, but it's a unified thing. But it's an arbitrary in that sense. So just as there's nothing natural about the way we divide up the color continuum, because we use different words for those things in different languages. There's also nothing natural about the way we articulate other things either. So we can go back to the Azadi natives and the discussion from the beginning of hermeneutics, ancient and modern. And they decided that in order to sow crops, they had to also do a magical incantation. Right? They had to do a certain, to the Westerner, nonsensical thing for the crops to grow. And the argument being used by that particular, and I can't remember his name now, cultural anthropologist was, why are we saying that what they're perceiving as necessary is unnecessary? On what basis? We're just using our system of conventions of signifiers and saying it's true for them as well. But those are just our conventions. Those are their conventions. Who's to say that they're right and we're wrong? The Western will say, but we don't need to use theirs in order to get the crops to grow, so therefore it's unnecessary, making a logical argument. But the cultural anthropologist is appealing to how words relate to things, and he's not appealing to the laws of logic or the nature of things. Because there is no nature. There's only convention. Is that? Okay. For Saussure, the whole world of language works in the same way. It's a system of difference. So the difference between one term and another is only within the system of conventions. It's not related to the difference of an idea from another idea. So the idea of truth and the idea of falsehood are rooted in the nature of reality for somebody that assumes that the world as it exists is natural. It's given to us, in other words, and we don't determine it by our language. Saussure doesn't agree. Everything is determined within the system of signs. So if we consider food, it couldn't mean anything without the concept of not food. So there's how we determine what food is. Food is it's determined by not food, but there's a basic binary breakdown of the system. So, and it happens through this binary system. Now this is where I need to move on to the binary, because the binary is really important here, and particularly when we come to contemporary literary theory, which is obsessed with deconstructing the binary. You've heard it. It's being applied in the school system and in cultural studies of all sorts. In politics, it's becoming an issue now. We want to deconstruct the binary. What do they mean by that? They mean the idea that there is a signified, a system of reality here, a race that's got what's got to go. And the reason it's got to go, though, is because everything is actually over here. Everything's actually a signified, or a signifier rather. And the signified as such really only comes out of the play of the signifiers. So what are these sorts of signifiers? Well, you can come up with all sorts of signifiers. So one could be, just as I said, food and not food. A more elemental one will be natural binaries. So, for example, male and female, day and night, land and sea. Those are binaries of sorts. The argument is that female only makes sense as not male, because that's what it comes down to. So all of these categories, in the one column, which we would say a female is in some sense not a male, that's all it is. So there's male and there's not male, and what we call a not male, that's a female. And so it's just a process of denial of the other. So and all of reality then conforms to a pattern of basically ones and zeros, just like binary code. The one is the zero, and the female is a zero. The one's a male, and the female is the zero. So it is nothing. So this is a system of oppression. Everything that's the binary opposite of the dominant feature, and this is where probably Freud comes in, and Marx to some degree gets brought into this, is that what is dominant is considered to have essential character, and its opposite is considered to have no character. It's the negation of that thing. We might call it female, but what we mean by it is it's not male, and therefore it has no value. Now I'm going a bit towards Derrida at this point, but to some degree, when you accept that the mental concepts arrive solely from the play of the signifiers rather, inevitably it starts to go in that direction. And whatever is dominant within that system of signification, because of the way that language works, inevitably means that its opposite has no value, no being, no nature, no importance. And they'll use all sorts of illustrations of this. So we'll talk about the Western world, which has value. It's ours. Within our conventions, the West matters. What doesn't matter? The East. We'll talk about the male. What doesn't matter? The female. We'll talk about the white. What doesn't matter? The black. You'll get the picture. It goes on and on. Now, those are applications, but they're applications based on the view of language that's operative here. So I've said repeatedly over the years, and I'm afraid I can't get my colleagues to listen to me on this, and not that it would matter because I can't get the academy to listen to me on this, that if you want to engage with the world around us, you have to understand the importance of the linguistic turn, because it's all important. This is the philosophies of our day are totally dependent on views of language. If the views of language are false, then they need to be overturned. And we need a Christian view of language. And I wouldn't say even a Christian view, although I do think it is a Christian view because that's the nature of God himself. He is the Word of God, right? He proceeds from the Father, and all things were created by the Word of God. And nothing exists except that he has created it. So it is rooted in Christian theology. But anyone who wants to acknowledge a real world in which reason can operate will have to move to the same camp. Even if they don't want to call themselves Christians, they'll have to acknowledge that these are necessary things. For me, this is powerfully persuasive in my coming to faith, by the way, was the idea that the primacy and the importance of words, and not agreeing to the fact that everything is just an endless play of signifiers, which is what deconstruction is going to argue. And there is no, above all, they will say, and this is Derrida's word or phrase, there is no transcendental signified. What's the transcendental signified? God. But the reason there's no transcendental signified is there's actually no signified. Strictly speaking, it doesn't exist. It's just from signifier playing to other signifier. Words relating to other words. Now is that coherent in some ways? I mean, I'm not explicating Saussure so much as the implications of basic things. But he sees language as a function of a system. Go back in that, back to that. Let me come at it a different way. I'll erase all of this. So it's interesting that the consequence of this view of language is that being arbitrary is that it overrules the will, or overrules reason. Right? So the use of language now is purely an arbitrary play of signifiers that every group uses to construct a view of reality that they want to live in. Every language community constructs that view of reality, but it's not really the reality, it's the one that they choose to live in. It doesn't have to conform to the world, it's the way they decide they're going to operate, and so then political correctness rises out of this. That's not the sort of world we want to live in. You can't use that word. You can't speak that way. Like Jordan Peterson objected and said, the gender identity thing is totally irrational. I can't operate as a psychologist if there's no empirical basis for this concept. And further, there's no actual connection between a person's biology and the concept of gender. And the theorists actually say this. There is no connection at all between the two. And he said, well, then how can I know, as somebody who's trying to be an academic and have integrity, whether this is true? Because it could just as easily be false, right? And so you're just telling me I have to use the words that you want me to use, even though I'm not persuaded in any way. Then I have no integrity. My conscience is totally destroyed, and I can't live in that world. It's not because he had any objections to people who were confused about their identity or feeling it wasn't that. It was just like, what are you asking me to do here? I can't actually have integrity if I accept this, so I'm not going to. The problem it's far deeper than the gender identity. That's not the issue. The issue is the use of language. Can language ever say true things about reality? In modern linguistic theory, it can't, because it never gets outside of language. Words refer to other words. They never refer to things in the sense of race, in the sense of a true reality. We can't say true things. We're caught up, in other words, to use Weaver's analogy, in the world of the nominalists. So nominalism as a heresy is accompanied by a sort of a Gnosticism about human nature. And with Gnosticism, you also get an elite who happens to exercise power, and they determine what reality is, and they know on the basis of some sort of secret knowledge that they can't reveal to you. Well, who are those priests of our day? Presumably the academics, and presumably also those who claim a gender identity at odds with their sexual identity. So go back. Another way of looking at this then. How do we isolate a coherent object of linguistics from the very different language uses? So go back to tree, Baum, arbre, whatever. Here Saussure introduces the idea of la langue. Language. Okay. And this is synchronic. It works with time. Whereas the uses of language, which he calls la parole, are the particular uses. So he makes distinctions here between the overarching language and then the actual uses of it. So the way that we separate it is a system. So there are theoretical ideas of what language are that will have the general structures, and then there are the actual operating principles. So here, there would be the tree, the Baum, the arbre, whatever. So he distinguishes a langue from a parole. And there are conventions that are there, and these will arise out of models of language that he comes up with. So structuralism looks at the synchronic use of language, which is what we use now, rather than looking at it diachronically. So he will look at it as it is currently used, not as it was used historically. So the reason why this is... So the diachronic use will look at terms as they have been used over the course of time. So if you look at and I will give you an illustration of this, and different dictionaries will have different principles for this. So the Oxford English Dictionary tries to trace the historic uses of terms as they go back, and will give you the etymology of words. And then the development of words as they change over the course of time. That's the diachronic use of language. With the idea that if you go back to the root of the language, you will get closer to the essence of the language. This is the system that Tolkien and Lewis would have operated on, which is why they want to know what the root meaning of a word is. So if I want to understand what English terminology is, I might have to look at its roots in Anglo-Saxon or Latin or Greek or Sanskrit or whatever its roots are. And that will then help me to understand its current usage as well, but it's rooted in the past. And it's rooted more in the sense that the original use of the language was rooted in the reality of the thing. So language, by that understanding, is a sort of a historically rooted and naturally rooted expression of a people's thought. That's the principle for Tolkien, Lewis, and their ilk. Whereas the modernists that they were fighting against within the academy had a synchronic use of language, and what really mattered was, what do we mean by words now? And the usage changes. So even the Oxford English Dictionary, but many of the dictionaries have, here's the word of the year. They come up with a new word. So people are using this word. I don't even know what is the word of the year now? I have no idea. They. Okay, yes. The word of the year, this is they. Yeah, you're right. It's they. Okay, excellent. So the word of the year now is they. Whoa, I've never heard of they before. I'm out of touch. Why they? Oh gosh, I don't want to get into this, do I? Why they? Well, because it's now being used, the plural is being used of singular. It's actually not, there's nothing new about that. That's been used in political correct speech since the 1980s. I've read it in undergraduate's essays for my entire time here at Tyndale, and I always mark it wrong. It's like, no, you can't have an individual that's a plural. It's a basic logical distinction. You might be trying to avoid using male-female pronouns, but you're creating a further problem, which is a confusion of number. Either there's a singular or there's a plural. So you can't use that, and people try and get around he or she by using one or whatever, find various formulations to avoid using she. But the they now is the word of the year. Why is it the word of the year according to the lexicographers? Just usage. So lexicography, as the dictionary is now using it, has nothing to do with the word being truthful, scientifically accurate, any of those things. It's just that it's popular effectively, at which point I would say the academy and lexicography becomes an exercise in ridiculous observation. And you could pick this up from word searches on the internet. Google will then tell you that the word of the year is they, because they could chart it on some sort of graph. Right, so so this is our word of the year. And it's a concept that is really meaningful. Well, is it? Well, how about if it drops away in 1 year because somebody decides that they is oppressive? Because they could. Like me, I find it oppressive. Not that I matter, but I find this an oppressive concept. I'm triggered by it. But that's a synchronic use, okay? So that's a distinction between the diachronic use of language, which sees it in its roots, and the roots relate to its further use down the way, over the course of time. Whereas the synchronic is only interested in this, and Saussure is only interested in the synchronic use of terms. Unsurprisingly. Because otherwise he'd be contradicted by prior uses of terminology. And otherwise, the Kantians likewise would be running into the medievalists who are not going to accept the Copernican turn that understanding arises out of reasoning, and they'll say, no, it's the other way around. right? And they would constantly be at odds. But if we can just look at synchronic usage, well, if everyone thinks like a Kantian, then we can disregard that. And so again, the academy is largely focused on contemporary ways of viewing it, and it's becoming increasingly irrational as a consequence. But that's because it disputes that there is such a thing as reasoning. What do you think of that? What's the binary model? Let me talk. I did mention the binary. Let me talk a little bit more about the binary. It's been averred to by simply this reference to the word of the year, they. Word of the year, which I learned when I learned to speak. But what do we need by the binary model? Because this becomes very important in postmodern literary theory. But what is meant by this? Well, it's the system of binary oppositions. One is, so a crucial one here is what he calls, I don't even know how to pronounce it in English, syntagm and a paradigm. What's a syntagm? A syntagmatic series is a combination. It's the relationships between the linguistic elements in a sentence. This is the syntagmatic way of looking at a sentence. It's the linguistic. It's the linear relationships between the various words. He painted the fence. Subject, verb, object. Subject, verb, object. Linear relationship. They're syntagmatically related. A paradigmatic way of looking at it, on the other hand, is a way of looking at elements within a sentence and other elements which are syntactically interchangeable. So he painted the fence. She kicked the man. They, in the plural sense, but I guess it could be the word of the year sense, they, these are paradigmatically related in the sense that they all have a subject, a verb, and an object. So these are different ways of binary models. The syntagmatic is within the sentence. The paradigmatic is taking different sentences that have the same relations. So this is another way of looking. Another way is the difference between metaphor and metonymy. A binary. So, for example, then, paradigmatic substitution involves a perception of similarity. So the ones that I laid below each other, there's a similarity between them in the sense that each has a subject, a verb, an object. So that's a metaphorical, right? That's the metaphorical similarity. Whereas a syntagmatic combination would be a perception of continuity, and that would give rise to metonymy. So, for example, okay, I'll use the one that is in my little example. Because it's better than anything that could come up. Does that make sense to you? In English? No? Keels of ships. I mean, it's a back from your practical criticism, synecdoche. Synecdoche. There's no C-H rather. Keels as in the part for a whole. 50 ships. The part of the ship representing the whole ship. Plowed is a metaphor. What do we mean by plowing? Well, you think of farmers plow their fields. But here the ship's prows cut through the water, they dig down. It's a metaphorical use. And the depths is a metonym. Because it's naming an attribute or an adjunct of the thing instead of the thing itself. It's not the sea. It's an attribute of the sea. It's deep. So these are not, so this, what I'm saying here is that his view of binaries allows for some complexity that it will include what we call figures of speech. They're just either syntagmatically related, that is within the line, or paradigmatically related within similar sorts of sentences. So there is a possibility for figures of speech within that and various types of that. Is that vaguely? I'm going to skip over Jacobson. Let me talk about, I've got 5 minutes. Let me talk about its application. I said I might get to this. Let me talk about Claude Lévi-Strauss, a French anthropologist. He follows Saussure and other linguistics and creates a structural anthropology arising out of this. And he systemizes what is effectively a semiology of culture. Now, when I say semiology, the word semiology comes from a system of signs. When Jacobson is writing, binary code is being used in the development of digital computers. You know, it's digital because it's got two. It uses ones and zeros, right? Digitalism uses the number 2 rather than a number 10 as its basic system of understanding reality. The decimal system is based on the number 10, right? So 0.1 is a tenth, 0.01 is a hundredth, 0.001 is a thousandth, and so on, right? So it's a system of 10. That's what our system of Celsius is based on, the number 10, right? That's the decimal system. This is the binary. So it's based on 2 rather than 10. So binary digitalism uses a base number of 2, and it computer information works in according to an on and an off switch, more or less. So when it's a 1, it's on. When it's a 0, it's off. And coding is constructed on those numbers. So when a 1's up, this goes on. When the 0's up, this goes off, and so forth. And the relation between these creates the coding. Now, language is what permits thinking. Now, thinking happens in Saussurean linguistics as well. It's just that the thinking doesn't conform to reality. It conforms to simply practical usage. but there's not a reality to which it conforms. It's the reality that you're creating. And in this sense, it is a lot like romantic ways of looking at the world. It's a created world that we're constructing. So thinking is the sort of the output of the system. So one of the questions that arises come the 20th century is what is thinking? First time it's asked is in the 20th century to some degree. And the figure that thinks about it the most is Hannah Arendt, who I'm unfortunately not being able to get to on this course, but I think is very helpful on this. And she actually thinks about thinking. You would have thought that philosophers would have thought about this before, but it's not a problem per se. They just do it. They don't think about thinking. But thinking is for Saussure and for Levi-Strauss, thinking is the system output, the output of the interplay of signifiers, which happens when human subjects, which are situated within their culture, interact with their environment, which is their nature. Note that how environment is now understood to be nature, and the culture is understood to be its opposite. So you get a different sense of nature and culture than was used historically. But anyway, but there's a binary here between a human and a non-human. And this will be a culture, and this will be a nature. So this is the binary that's going on here. What comes out of this then, of course, according to the same sort of thinking, is that nature that's not human is a zero. So this is a form of absolute oppression. This is the leitmotif of the environmental movement in our day. And they're going to say that it's historical, etc., but there's no historical provenance for this sort of thinking. It's a 20th century way of looking at the world. Now, I will agree that looking at the world this way leads to a devastation of nature. That's the legacy of the 20th century. That's true. But it's a legacy which is a consequence of looking at language in this way. It's not rooted in humanity's historic oppression of the environment, because it didn't exist in the past. They lived with the environment. And it was because Christians had an understanding of the relation of the world. Yep, it's about that time. So thinking can occur because language allows us to form social relationships and to categorize our environment in various symbols and so forth. So according to Levi-Strauss, the totemism which we talked about last time is not primitive superstition. It is a basic instance of logic. It is thinking. It's just a different type of thinking. And it's got a validity within their system of thinking, and it's valid within that, and it can't be scrutinized from outside that. But that's their way, their culture's way of relating to nature. But we can't adjudicate between different cultural understandings and uses of language in relation to this, because all that this is, nature doesn't have a nature, it's just not human. So nature's been reduced to its opposition to humanity here. So all of these things arise out of structural linguistics. You see, what's the environmental movement going to see as nature? If this is your way in which you understand nature, which is that it is a non-human thing, it is the opposite of a culture, then you're going to see culture and humanity as inherently oppressive, because it's just the not negation of that. So in order to rectify that negation, you have to negate culture and humanity, which is happening right now. In eco-criticism, eco-feminist criticism, and its latest iteration, ahumanism. We'll come to that at the end of the course. We're just going to rectify the wrongs that have been done throughout the course of human history. Actually, they began in the 20th century with this fallacious view thinking. But it's the academy's way of thinking about the world which is fallacious, being rectified within the academy by further wrongs. And now the environment's not being despoiled only. We'll also find that human beings are also going to be targeted. And cultures are going to be targeted likewise because they're oppressive, etc. But I'll come to that later on in the course. Okay?